Joan Baez was born on January 9, 1941, on Staten Island, New York, into a Quaker family. She was the middle of three sisters. Although her parents raised their daughters with humanist values, Joan learned early on what it meant to be different in American society. She inherited her father's darker complexion, and at school she often became the target of racist taunts. Those humiliations left a permanent mark on her and sparked a lifelong passion for justice, equality, and human rights. Even in her school years, Baez refused to conform to social rules. Her first act of civil disobedience happened at Palo Alto High School, when she refused to leave the classroom during an air raid drill. Music, in its own way, was also an act of defiance, though in this case against her parents' wishes. Joan got her first ukulele as a gift from one of her father's friends. With just 4 chords, she learned to play rhythm and blues, the music she loved at the time. But her religious parents weren't pleased, fearing that music would lead her down the road to drugs. Joan stood her ground, openly strumming her favorite tunes. Her aunt encouraged her passion, and at 13, took Joan to a concert by folk legend Pete Seeger. Sitting in the audience, Joan was struck by the honesty of the genre. She realized she wasn't just hearing music. She was witnessing a tool that could carry powerful messages to people. Soon after, she began rehearsing Seeger's songs and eventually dared to perform in public for the first time at a retreat in Saratoga, California, for a youth group from Temple Beth Jacob in Redwood City. At that stage, she was still just a shy girl with a ukulele, without the faintest thought of a major career. Everything changed in 1958 when her family moved from San Francisco to Boston, and Joan enrolled at Boston University. She had landed in the right place at the right time. By the late 50s, Massachusetts had become the heart of America's emerging folk music revival. After dull university lectures, Baez would head to the coffee houses of Harvard Square, where students, activists, poets, and musicians gathered to play old ballads, protest songs, and Mexican corridos. Here, the pieces fell into place. Her teenage fascination with folk music merged with her growing passion for social justice. Her first official concert took place in 1958 at Club 47 in Cambridge. Few people know that while preparing for the show, Baez even considered adopting a stage name. She toyed with 2 options: Rachel Sandpearl in honor of her longtime idol, Yera Sandpearl, or simply Maria, after the song They Call the Wind Maria. In the end, she abandoned the idea, fearing people would accuse her of trying to hide her Spanish surname. That first audience was tiny, just 8 people, including her boyfriend, sister, parents, and a few friends. Her parents continued to nag her to focus on her studies, pointing out that she had even paid $10 for the chance to perform. But her unusually high, crystal-clear soprano stood out immediately, drawing attention from those who heard it. Soon, Club 47 invited her back, offering $25 per show to perform twice a week. It was a modest start, but the beginning of something extraordinary. Despite her shyness on stage, Joan was an outgoing young woman off it. She quickly made friends among fellow folk enthusiasts, and they encouraged her to record an album at a makeshift studio. The result was Folk Singers Round Harvard Square, released in May 1959.
Down by the banks of the Ohio.
It wasn't so much a commercial project as it was a way to introduce herself and build connections, and that's exactly what it did. Through that record, Joan met Bob Gibson and Odetta, at the time not only 2 of the most outstanding folk and gospel singers, but also central figures in the folk revival. Gibson was struck by Joan's voice and invited her to join him as a guest performer at the Newport Folk Festival. That invitation changed everything. Joan was only 18. Just months earlier, she had been singing to a handful of people. And now she was on stage with Bob Gibson, performing the duet, Virgin Mary Had One Son. The performance caused a sensation in the press. Critics called her the barefoot Madonna with a haunting voice. Record labels lined up immediately, with Columbia Records among the first to offer her a contract. But Joan wasn't chasing money or fame. What she wanted was creative freedom. So instead, she signed with the smaller Vanguard Records. With that signature, her professional career began, and once again, fortune was on her side. By 1960, folk music was at its peak. Joan quickly recorded her debut album, released that summer. It was anything but commercial, recorded in just 4 days in the ballroom of the Manhattan Towers Hotel in New York, featuring only her voice and guitar. The producers weren't expecting much, and Joan herself wasn't aiming for a hit. But songs like Silver Dagger and East Virginia carried a stark simplicity that gave the record incredible power. Listeners felt they were hearing not just a young singer, but a voice carrying the pain and truth of generations. Against all odds, the album charted and stayed there for a long time, an unusual feat for early 60s folk. Joan couldn't be stopped. It was as if all the emotions she had carried through her youth were now pouring out in the recording studio. By 1961, she released her second album, Joan Baez Volume 2, proving her debut was no accident. Once again, she turned traditional ballads into dramatic statements through her interpretation. The purity of her soprano made simple stories of love, death, and loyalty feel universal, almost timeless. The record reached the Billboard Top 20 and cemented her as a star on college campuses. For young people searching for new values and rejecting conformity, Joan was more than a singer. She was an ally. At the same time, one might argue that her success wasn't only about talent, but also timing. Baez shone in a vacuum. At the dawn of the folk revival of the early 60s, there was no fresh, commanding voice to lead the movement. Once again, Joan had found herself in the right place at the right time. Alongside the release of her second album, 1961 also brought Joan Baez face-to-face with a young and ambitious Bob Dylan. Their meeting not only left a bold mark on each of their careers, but also profoundly shaped the future of folk music itself. Joan was already a recognized name, while Dylan was just an up-and-coming songwriter with a raspy voice and a strange delivery that put many people off. But she immediately sensed in him the force of a poet, a prophet even, capable of voicing the anxieties of a generation, something she herself preferred to channel through the songs of others. When Baez began bringing him on stage during her concerts, she essentially loaned him her audience. In fact, it was Joan who first introduced Dylan to the wider public, which is why critics often referred to her as his godmother in music. Their personal and creative lives quickly intertwined, and the impact on Joan's career was undeniable. Her concert albums from 1962 and 1963 clearly show a shift. She was moving away from strictly traditional ballads and toward becoming the voice of the present, adding Dylan's songs like With God on Our Side and Don't Think Twice. It's all right to her repertoire. And it's worth noting, these songs only reached a broad audience because of her interpretations. To listeners, the Baez-Dylan partnership became a symbol of unity. Her angelic soprano and his hard-edged lyrics represented two poles of the same reality, the yearning for peace and the need to call out injustice. That dynamic was especially powerful in 1963 when Baez appeared at the March on Washington alongside Martin Luther King Jr. The stage became not just a concert venue but a platform for civil conscience. By 1964, it seemed that both had found their place. Baez had become the voice of a generation, while Dylan had gained recognition as a songwriter and artist with a reputation. But their breakup in the mid-60s was both painful and destabilizing for Joan, personally and creatively. Their relationship had already begun to crack in 1964, as Dylan drifted away from folk and toward electric rock. To Baez, it felt almost like betrayal, not only of her but of the ideals they had shared. She remained loyal to acoustic protest songs while he seemed, in her eyes, to be moving toward show business and commercial success. The symbolic breaking point came in 1965, during Dylan's tour of England. Joan flew in expecting to perform alongside him, but he almost completely excluded her from the program. Suddenly, she was in the shadows, just a few years after she had been the one to bring him into the spotlight. The disappointment was sharp, but it forced her to rethink her own direction. From then on, Joan's career leaned more and more into activism. Her concerts became rallies, and the stage became less about entertainment and more about public action. This turn was especially clear during the Vietnam War years. Baez publicly refused to pay the portion of her taxes that funded the war, openly declaring her pacifism. In 1966, she even spent brief time in jail for acts of civil disobedience, which only reinforced her reputation as the conscience of a nation. At the same time, she continued to release albums. Farewell, Angelina in 1965 was one of her first after parting ways with Dylan. It still featured some of his songs, but the overall material emphasized her independence. The title track, a dark, foreboding Dylan ballad, felt like her closing statement on their artistic union. Her 1967 album, Joan, widened her scope even further. Traditional ballads were fading into the background, and she began turning to contemporary writers. It was the beginning of her move toward a more diverse repertoire, a recognition that the era of pure folk was passing, even as she remained committed to her social stance. During these years, she was also a fixture at major anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, her name appearing not only in music columns but in political headlines. Once again, her personal life became entangled with her activism. In 1968, she married David Harris, an anti-draft activist and one of the leaders of the resistance to conscription. Their union was almost symbolic, the marriage of a singer who embodied pacifism and a man openly defying the draft system. But by 1969, Harris was arrested and jailed for refusing military service. During this time, Joan threw herself into supporting him, dedicating songs to him and turning her concerts into platforms for anti-war protest. Musically, the late 60s didn't bring any radical experiments for Joan. In 1968, she released the double album, Any Day Now, made up entirely of Dylan's songs, but reimagined in her own voice. In a way, it was her acknowledgement of his artistry, while at the same time proving how effortlessly she could make his songs her own. It wasn't meant as a statement or an insult. It was more a quiet affirmation of her stature as a folk diva. By the end of the decade, though, Baez had shifted from being the voice of a generation to becoming its moral compass. That transformation was most visible at her performance at Woodstock in 1969, where she seemed almost aware that she was outgrowing the role she'd once played. She wanted change, and she dedicated the next decade to finding it. In 1970, she released the unusual album One Day at a Time, which for the first time featured her own compositions. Songs like Sweet Sir Galahad, a tender tribute to her sister Mimi Farina, and a song for David, written for her husband David Harris while he was in prison for refusing service in Vietnam, revealed a more personal side. The album wove together traditional folk, country, and deeply intimate storytelling. It marked a turning point. Baez was no longer just an interpreter of others' songs, but was stepping into her own as a songwriter, which gave her music a new intimacy. She also began moving beyond pure folk. Her 1971 album, Blessed Are, leaned more heavily into country with touches of pop. Yet even as her music grew more eclectic, it also became less commercial and increasingly political. In 1972, she traveled to Vietnam on a peace mission, surviving the bombing of Hanoi. That harrowing experience later surfaced in her 1973 album, Where Are You Now, My Son? It was one of her boldest works. One side carried traditional songs and ballads, while the other was a 20-minute sound collage blending her voice with real recordings of bombings and people's cries. It wasn't a commercial move, it was a political manifesto, and critics hailed it as one of the most daring projects of her career. That same year, her marriage to Harris fell apart. The reason was simple. He began to see Baez primarily as an activist rather than a partner. While she recalled that Harris believed family life and politics were fundamentally incompatible. After the divorce, Joan was left to raise their son, Gabriel. She continued her activism, though with less fiery zeal, pouring more of her energy into her music. In 1975, she released Diamonds and Rust, the pinnacle of her decade. The title track, one of her most famous original works, looked back at her past and, in poetic but unmistakable terms, recalled her history with Dylan. It became her personal anthem and her signature song as a writer. The album blended her own material with covers of contemporaries like Jackson Browne and Jethro Tull's Ian Anderson, creating a rich and mature record that proved she could still be relevant in the rock era. By the late 70s, she continued releasing albums, including Gulf Winds in 1976, which was made up entirely of her own songs. These works carried personal reflections, political commentary, and meditations on her own path. But her commercial popularity began to decline. Folk itself was fading from the mainstream, while protest had found new homes in rock and punk. Joan Baez was no longer just a star, she was becoming a legend. By the 1980s, Joan Baez understood the challenge she faced: how to stay relevant without betraying herself. In 1980, she released Honest Lullaby, her first record to openly touch on her private life and relationships. But the album failed to capture a broad audience, and Joan began shifting her focus. Her later works leaned toward a more contemporary sound. On Live Europe '83 and the studio album Recently, 1987, you can hear clear attempts to weave in rock and pop arrangements. Critics noted that her voice had taken on a warmer, more mature tone, yet it still carried the same power and instantly recognizable clarity. Still, it was hard to say whether these records were aimed at commercial success or simply meant to preserve her presence as a political voice. Her music remained respected, but her glory days were behind her. Perhaps because of that, she poured new energy into human rights and activism. Baez lent her voice to the Polish Solidarity movement, protested against Latin American dictatorships, and spoke out for refugees and prisoners of conscience. She traveled to Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, where her concerts were both cultural and political events. In 1985, she appeared at Live Aid, giving her a chance to address the world stage again. Against the backdrop of global charity, her pacifist message felt especially at home. The mid-'80s also brought important collaborations. In 1984, she released Gracias a la Vida, turning to Latin American song traditions with works by Victor Jara, Violeta Parra, and others. It was a bold embrace of internationalism, showing her solidarity with struggles beyond her own borders. At the same time, she stayed tied to the American scene. Recently in Diamonds and Rust in the Bullring, 1988, included both her own material and covers of contemporary artists like U2 and Paul Simon. Offstage, Baez spent the decade being a mother. She often said motherhood gave her both the strength for activism and the inspiration for music. The 1980s were turbulent years for her. She pushed musical boundaries, tried to break free from being just the folk legend of the 60s, yet the feeling that her peak was past never fully left. Increasingly, Joan Baez was seen less as a musician and more as a human rights figure. The 1990s carried that same mix. While many of her folk peers reimagined themselves, Joan tried to remain the mature voice of conscience. In 1992, she released Play Me Backwards, her first studio album after years of live recordings. Its sound was surprisingly contemporary, shaped by rock and pop production, but what stood out most were the lyrics. Baez didn't shy away from difficult themes, touching on violence and even childhood trauma, proving that 3 decades into her career, she still had the courage to speak hard truths. Yet at the same time, the album didn't add anything dramatically new to her artistry. Outside of music, she kept her activist spirit alive. In 1993, she performed in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War, a symbolic gesture that showed her willingness to risk her own safety for her convictions. These performances made her less a singer than a global voice of conscience. In 1995, she returned to music with Ring Them Bells, recorded live with guests like Mary Black and Dar Williams. It felt less like a commercial release and more like a gathering of friends, but critics praised its honesty. In 1997, she released Gone from Danger, spotlighting songs from young writers such as Dar Williams and Sinead Lohan. It was as if she were passing the torch to a new generation, though her interpretations still made the songs unmistakably her own. Maybe the influence of younger artists shaped her in some way, because by the 2000s it felt like Joan Baez was singing with a new voice. In a sense, it was a powerful comeback. In 2003, she released Dark Chords on a Big Guitar, an album built on songs by younger writers like Steve Earle, Gillian Welch, and Josh Ritter. Her choice of material showed that she wasn't stuck in the past. She was paying attention to new music and finding voices that resonated with her own. Her interpretations gave those modern songs a rare depth and wisdom. In 2005 came Bowery Songs, a live album that proved her stage presence was still alive and commanding, and that audiences continued to see her, not just as a singer, but as a prophetic voice. Even more important was Day After Tomorrow, 2008, produced by Steve Earle. It earned a Grammy nomination and wide critical praise. The song spoke of war, exile, hope, and faith, the very heart of her lifelong themes. For Baez, the album was proof that even in a new century, she could stay relevant and keep addressing the hardest truths. At the same time, her activism never slowed down. In the 2000s, she joined protests against the Iraq War, supported human rights campaigns around the world, and stood up for migrants and prisoners. Her presence remained as political as it was musical. The final chapter of her career was marked by farewell tours. In 2017, she announced she was preparing one last major concert cycle. The following year, she released her final album, Whistle Down the Wind, once again filled with songs by contemporary writers from Tom Waits to Josh Ritter. The album was warmly received, with critics noting that while her voice had lost its crystalline youth, it had gained a soft, seasoned warmth that suited both her age and her legacy. In 2019, she brought her global farewell tour to a close, performing across the US, Europe, and Latin America. For the audience, those concerts felt like a farewell, not just to a singer, but to an entire era, a time when music could truly be a weapon of protest and a vessel of hope. Looking back at Joan Baez's life, she can confidently be called an extraordinary artist. Music was never just a career for her. It was a tool that made her a political activist, the voice of a generation, and a moral compass. It's hard to name another artist who, like Baez, stayed true to herself, never chased trends, but instead redefined them. Most of all, Joan Baez proved that art doesn't just decorate reality, it has the power to transform it. In her voice, people didn't just hear music, they heard a belief that the world could change. If you sang about it honestly and without fear,